Hello, my name is Vincent Nixon, and I'm just going to take you through really quickly my editing process. And I'm going to start with this image I took with Hannah. Now, this is actually pre-edited, so I'm just going to really quickly set the defaults back so I can show you the process. That was a bit of an accidental Blue Peter moment. It was I went to the this is the one I did earlier a bit too soon. I can see the image is slightly washed out. It's not picking up all the colour that I would want. So I'm definitely going to go in and fix that. But the first thing I'm going to do is go to my lens corrections, and I'm going to remove my chromatic aberration, which is a great term, and enable profile corrections. And what that does is it just accounts for the camera's natural distortion and puts things back into the way that the naked eye would see them, as opposed to the way that the camera picks up. Usually it's quite flattering, as the camera does tend to expand things within the center of its focus, and when it's fixed you look a little bit smaller. Fab. So I'm going to leave the exposure because I think it's slightly overexposed, but when you up the contrast like I like to do, you often need a little bit more exposure to balance that out, because it does tend to make the image a little bit darker. So lower some highlights, maybe up some shadows, because I do think it's a little bit too light, like the reflection off the hair is just a little bit bright. And there we go. I'm going to darken the blacks as well and get this background really nice and saturated. I don't like to mess with saturation too much. I think that it can lead to your image just becoming totally blown out. If anything, by the time I get to the bottom of this list, I like to take my saturation down, but I'm not going to do that at the minute. I will see about vibrance though, because when we turn vibrance up we get a little bit too much, so we don't want it all the way. But I do think a little bit, just to bring that purple out, will look really good. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with the quick edit we've just done there. So let's take it into Photoshop. So here we are in Photoshop, and the very first thing I'm going to do is copy my background. And I do that because I like to keep my background layer locked and intact. Now I'm just going to scan the background for any folds, any creases, and take them out. I'm using the patch tool to do this. It's a little bit quick and dirty, but it does the job and it does it pretty well. I think I'm going to dive straight into it and do a frequency separation. So frequency separations are one of the industry standard ways of photo retouching. I'm going to walk you through how that works. So I'm using a pre-made Photoshop action. You can do this all manually, but the process doesn't change, so you may as well just use an action. It's very much the same no matter what you do, with the exception of if you're doing really, really big or perhaps really small files. You may need to play around with some of the values a bit, but for the most part, this is going to be it. So it's just copied the layer that I started on with two new layers for the frequency separation, and then one of these layers is going to be our blended layer. So what you want to do is, when it brings up the Gaussian blur, make sure one of your layers, and again it's set to a value which is pretty spot on. What you want to do is make sure that there's no full-blown skin texture showing through on the blur layer. So I think that's pretty much done a good job of getting rid of all the texture. I think everything that's left is colour. So I'm going to OK that. and then this is going on the layer above the one we just blurred, and this is going to completely erase all the color and leave us with only the pure texture of the image. So just going to OK all of this. And so you can see, if I take away, I'll zoom in a little bit. So you can see, if I take away the texture, then we just get a blurred image. Then we add the texture back in, and it's the same as the layer below it. There's no functional difference. And if I take away, if I take away the blur layer, then we've got just the texture underneath as well. So how you edit this, you want to, or at least this is the order that I like to do it in, is first to edit out all the discrepancies in the colour, and then go and edit a lot of the discrepancies in the texture. Now, it's kind of it's one of those things where you'd be surprised how much skin is fixed with only the colour. Fixed is a bit of an operative term. We don't like to say fixed, but you're surprised how much skin is smoothed with only the colour. Texture doesn't have as much of a role to play as you may initially think. So what I'm going to do is start by selecting the right tool. So I'm on the lasso tool. I've got a 20 pixel feather on there, so that just means that it comes out. If I were to do something really sharp like this, it rounds it out for me. And it also blends those edges. So when it's actually quite hard to see, but I'm going back in and blending on the blur layer, and I've got preview on, so I can see how that looks on the big image and how it looks close up on the blur layer itself. And what you want to do is just increase the blur until that discoloration has disappeared. So if I put the preview on and off, we can see that that's literally just blurred the skin tone through. And that was just something that came up with the makeup. When you do a heavy kind of style of makeup like this, there's bound to be some irregularities, and somewhere, you might accidentally touch your cheek without thinking about it. And little things happen. So there we go. I'm pretty happy with that. So one of the things that I do like to do with my models, and is part of the best practice system, it's really important to me that all the models understand, at least from a layman's point of view, the processes that they're agreeing to take, that they're agreeing that are going to happen to their bodies and their image. So we can't really discount that when it comes to editing. So I always try to run through roughly what will happen, and if they have any issues with that, where do we go from there? So I won't necessarily explain it in this much detail, but I'll say to them, I will be using, it's my intention to use processes that smooth the skin but retain the texture, so that you don't look like a Barbie doll, but you do how it will make the skin appear smoother. And the tones of the skin, the coloration of the skin will be evened out. I also do like to make it clear that as much as possible I try to retain the original skin tone, but sometimes when you just edit color values, it isn't always a realistic thing that you can do. So depending totally on the individual image, you can sometimes end up with a skin tone that comes out a little bit lighter or a little bit darker. Now, that may be a major issue for some people, which is totally understandable. So it's just something that's worth watching and worth understanding. Not so much a problem here, as we are, in fact, editing a purple woman. However, for example, if someone's had a very personal journey with accepting the colour of their skin and learning to love the colour of their skin, I think it's then inappropriate to discard their feelings towards the way that they could be edited in a photo shoot if they feel very strongly one way or another about the way they're edited in regards to that. So I'm fairly happy with that. I'm just going to go back and mess with this little area of the neck. I did quite a strong highlight, so I just want to diffuse it a little bit. I see there's some slightly patchier areas on the neck as well. My approach to this is, I'll probably say this a few times during the course of this, a little bit quick and dirty. I think that's the best way to edit. If you make a mistake, you can go back and fix it. There are lots of ways for you to do that. But I just think it's a bit of a, potentially a bit of a waste of time, just obsessing over every pixel. Sort of paint by numbers until you need to go back and fix fix the painting by numbers. And that's very much like an instinctual approach. It's the same when you it's like different approaches to things like oil painting. Like I'm someone who will paint in layers, and I'll do one layer and then I'll add more detail in the next layer, and I'll fix things and add more detail in the next layer and paint on top, correcting as I go. Whereas some people paint, they'll start on one corner of the canvas and paint all the way down to the opposite corner and the other side, and then they're done, all in one swoop. And that is impressive, but very scary to me. So I don't tend to do that. So what I'm going to do now is edit the texture. So basically what I'm doing is using the clone stamp tool, which takes pixels from other parts of the image and applies them to where you've selected. So doing this only on the texture layer lets us basically replace only the texture while leaving the colours completely intact, which is great. That's what we want. I like to do this in small sections, and then what I'm doing is going back and resampling, and so I don't like the diffusion up here of the colour, so I'm just going to go back and fix that. And that's what I like about this method, is you can just go back and tweak and tweak and tweak. If something doesn't feel right, you can just go back and fix it. So yeah, I like to sort of constantly be resampling and moving around, because I feel like that gives the most natural finish, and still leaves you with texture to play with. Now, another example of me doing something wrong is I've just missed the under eye area, which is often an area of discoloration, and that discoloration does carry through a little bit, even under heavy makeup like this. It's all part of an underlayer kind of thing, so fix that, and then what I'm going to do is just take that and paint over it. And there we go. So this is going to be a little bit of a sensitive area, because what we're seeing isn't so much the skin's texture as it is where the makeup has cracked ever so slightly. So we want to remove that cracking without making the image not look very good. So this is another example of finding out something's wrong. I can see this area here. I'm not too happy with that. So I'm going to go back in. Just blend it. Boop. Oh, whoops. Just fix that. So it's kind of important for me to make sure that whilst I'm showing a representation of someone that is fit for purpose, that it's also something that the individual would be happy with and proud of, because I think there's no real point to doing this if you're not empowering someone or making someone feel a certain way, or suggesting an idea. I think that's an important thing that sometimes gets lost in the desire to just make things as quote unquote pretty as they can be. Oh dear, got a little bit of misplaced, whoops, got a little bit of misplaced eyelash texture. Oh, I know what I've done. Silly me. Was on the wrong layer. Classic Photoshop blunder. So we've still got texture to the skin, but it does look a little bit smoother. So just to show the difference, this is our before and this is our after. So I've just removed the discoloration, smoothed out some of the issues that I've had, and generally cleaned it up. Another thing that I'm going to do is just remove this eyebrow. That was something that me and Hannah talked about, whether to do an eyebrow cover or not, and that is not the best. It is a difficult makeup process. It's hard to work around, and it would have probably required me to go back and edit it anyway. It's one of those stage makeup tricks that's on the stage for a reason, and that reason is it looks really great from far away. I'm not too pleased about that. This eyebrow I'm going to have to fix a little bit later. I've got plans. So that's like the general process for the skin. It does make quite a dramatic difference. But again, as long as you're keeping in mind the model's wishes, Hannah was very happy for me to do whatever I needed to do after I explained it to her, like the typical processes that I would use. Um, she was all for it. So what I'm going to do now is some more wider touching up. I'm going to use well, first I'm going to copy this. I'm going to merge the copy. So I still have my frequency separation layers. If there's anything major that I've missed that I want to fix later on, I can go back to them. So I'm going to run into Liquify. Liquify is slightly controversial because it can be used to very quickly and very easily edit body proportions. For example, I can literally, within 2 clicks, make someone's arms smaller, and then I'm just going to restore that. But I think that kind of conceptually that is definitely not what the project here is about. And it's not something that I think is appropriate to do in general. All I'm doing is using it to even out a kink in the hair. And how I like to do that is just by using the forward warp tool. And oh, whoops, that was a little bit exciting. So I'm just going to use the forward warp tool and pull it out to where I want it to be. And then once it's pulled out, I do it too much. So this is a technique that I learned is forward warp and warping in general tends to leave you with these unnatural looking, very clearly edited waves. So what I like to do is get it over the top, and I'll use the reconstruct tool, and that sort of just blends everything together. And restores a more natural look to it. I like to go into preview to make sure that I'm doing everything correctly. So yeah, it's like a really minor difference, but I've just evened out that kink a little bit. I'm going to restore down here a little bit as well. Again, it's one of those things, it seems like a minor change, but it's something that's a little bit important to me, just to keep that image flowing and keep it compositionally right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fix this eyebrow up a little bit, and there are a few ways I could do this. I could pinch or pucker the area, but I think what I'm going to do is just again using the forward warp, like the most basic tool. I'm just going to push this area where it's more gradiented. I'm going to push that out. As I said before, because I've just warped all this texture, I'm going to use the restore tool. Bring that all back, and then do it slightly wrong. Well, that's alright, because we're going to go back and fix it. Lovely. So I'm fairly happy with that. And the last thing that I'm going to do to this particular image is just touch up the makeup a little bit. So this is something that happens during a shoot all the time. You know, you get things like glue residue on the eyelid. Over time, the makeup fades. sometimes when you apply your products over to touch up something you were doing, it ruins other products, and what you don't want is to be sat in the makeup chair for 2 hours touching up and doing little things. It just wastes everyone's time. So you can just fix it a little bit later on. So it's good not to rely on these things, but if it's just a case of it needs to be done, then by all means. So I'm on a new layer. I'm literally going to paint black into this selection, deselect it, then really sloppy. And again, just really sloppy, doesn't matter too much at this point, and you'll see why. So lower that opacity down, change the blend mode. Cool. So go back to my blur. This is just Gaussian blur, and you want to blur it a little bit just to make it look a little bit more natural, which is why I wasn't too bothered about it being sloppy, because I knew that I was going to blur the edges anyway. And areas that have been bled into a little bit too much, just use hard eraser and fix that. And then it's like little things, but like to me that makes all the difference in the world. Other people might think that I'm a little bit insane, but you know. Something else I want to do is touch up some of these flyaway hairs. I'm just going to do that with our old friend. I'll turn the hardness up. Our old friend Clone Stamp. Define my source point, and as easy as that, make sure that wherever you get there aren't any inconsistencies. You want to have no flyaway hairs, but then a small section of floating hair. Oh, see? I'm just gonna, and this is just gonna make the hair seem a little bit more sleek, which is what we want. Again, really minor change. If you can see a little bit of color discrepancy, that's fine. You just need to go back into Patch Tool, select very roughly the area that there's like a little discrepancy in, just drag it somewhere else, and it sort of just blends in the tones a little bit. There we go. So that was my really quick editing. There are loads of optional things that I could have done. For example, a common one, people like to brighten and slightly saturate the irises a little bit. But I thought there was so much colour going on in this, I thought any more would just be a little bit much. The teeth, these teeth are actually painted red, which is something we did during the shoot. Some of the pictures show like the red smile. It's quite scary, but it's very good. But commonly, if someone's teeth are showing, there's always the process of whitening as well, whitening the whites of the eyes in the same vein, just because sometimes they can be a little bit discoloured or red if there's an intense makeup or an irritant that's sort of just unfortunately happened. Yeah, there's all kinds of little bits and bobs that you can do, but I'm fairly happy with how this is now. And I'm gonna drag in the original raw file just to show the entire difference. So this is the raw file, no edits. It's going to drop in as a smart object. So this is what we originally worked from, and this is what we ended up with. So I think that's just, I think it's a really pronounced difference, and really just makes the image so much cleaner, makes it pop more, it holds more tension, and is more in line with the sort of general aesthetic that I'm sort of curating throughout the project. So I'm really happy with that. When you compare the two, the original just seems so washed out. I think that's more of like a trick of the eye, because it's not that. But they weren't that washed out originally. But when you compare the two, there's no comparison. Okay, lovely. So that was my editing process. I hope you enjoyed.